The galaxy attacked one human diplomat, unaware he was death in human form. The chamber doors had not fully opened when the first insult landed. I felt it before I heard it. A shift in the room. The kind of quiet that settles over a crowd when someone walks into a space they were not meant to walk into. 300 alien delegates, seated in curved tiers around a central floor of polished white stone, and every single one of them looked at me the way people look at something that does not belong. I walked to my assigned seat anyway. My name is Owen Grant. I am 51 years old. I have gray at my temples and a small scar above my left eyebrow from a situation I am not permitted to discuss in any public document. I wear a dark suit. I carry no weapon. I never need to. The seat they had assigned me was in the outer gallery, behind a row of tall decorative plants that looked like blue coral and smelled faintly of something sweet and medicinal. It was not technically outside the chamber. It was simply positioned in such a way that I could not see the central floor clearly, could not be seen clearly by anyone on it, and could not reach the speaker's floor without walking past 8 rows of seated delegates who would have to stand to let me through. I sat down. I adjusted the front of my jacket. I accepted the small cup of warm liquid and aid pressed into my hand. The aid had dark eyes and moved quickly, the way people move when they have been told to complete a task before someone notices them doing it. I thanked her. She looked surprised. The Galactic Conclave had been meeting in formal session for 400 years. Humanity had been aware of it for 6. We had been granted a provisional seat 3 years ago, after what the Conclave's official record described as a petition period, and what our own internal files described as 14 months of increasingly tense back-channel negotiations that I will not detail here. We had been told the provisional period would last 2 years. We were now in year 3, and the renewal vote had not yet been scheduled. I already knew why. The conclave opened with a ceremonial reading of member classifications. This was standard. The senior herald, a tall creature of the species called the Veil, moved through the list in a low, carrying voice that the translation device in my ear rendered into clean, flat English. Full members, associate members, observer states, and then near the end, a new category that had not existed in any document I had read before traveling here. Client ward states. Earth was the first and only entry on that list. I drank my tea. It tasted like warm grass and something faintly metallic, but it was not unpleasant. I kept my face entirely still. I have had a great deal of practice keeping my face still. Client ward status meant, in formal galactic law, that Earth was classified as a developing civilization requiring guidance and oversight from established members. It meant our vote, when we eventually received one, would be advisory only. It meant our colony on Kepler 7, the one we had spent 11 years building at enormous cost in resources and human lives and human ingenuity, could be reclassified as contested territory at the conclave's discretion. It meant, in plain language, that someone had decided humanity needed a leash. I watched the chamber react to the announcement. Most delegates showed nothing. A few of the smaller species turned briefly toward the gallery where I sat, curious, the way you look at something to see how it responds to bad news. The Drakvi delegation, 8 of them in the second tier, their broad armored shoulders nearly touching, did not look at me at all. That was more informative than if they had. The Drakvi were the conclave's enforcement arm. Not officially. The conclave had no official enforcement arm, but if a member state needed a border dispute resolved quickly, or a client ward state needed reminding of its position, it was Drakvi ships that appeared in orbit. Their species had been members for over 200 years and had participated in more territorial adjustments than any other member state in conclave history. I noted their position in the chamber. I noted the weight distribution of the security personnel near the floor exits. I noted that the personal communication dampener near the speaker's platform extended approximately 15 meters in radius, which meant it covered roughly 2/3 of the first tier, but did not reach the outer gallery. I noted all of this the way you note the position of furniture when you walk into an unfamiliar room. Automatically, without effort. It is simply how I process spaces. The session continued for another 2 hours. I listened to every word. I learned more from the pauses between words, from the order in which topics were introduced, from who spoke and who chose not to, than I learned from the formal content itself. By the time the herald called for a recess, I had a clear picture of what had happened in the 3 weeks before my arrival and a reasonable estimate of what was planned for the 3 weeks after. None of it was good for Earth. All of it was deliberate. During the recess, I walked to the refreshment area near the chamber's east entrance. I stood near a window that looked out onto the station's exterior, where the stars sat still and cold and utterly indifferent to the proceedings inside. I ate something small and pale that tasted mildly of citrus. I watched the room in the reflection of the glass. The veiled diplomat found me there. His name, as translated by the conclave's own records, was something close to Helvin. He was tall, with a long face and pale gray skin, and the particular kind of composure that comes from never having been seriously challenged. He had been a conclave diplomat for 30 years. He was, by several accounts, very good at his work. He stood beside me at the window and did not bother with an introduction. "You understand what today's classification means," he said. It was not a question. "I understand the legal definition," I said. "Then you understand that Earth's provisional status will not be renewed in its current form." He turned slightly toward me. "The conclave has made its determination. The client ward designation is a transition measure. It is not intended to be permanent." "What is it intended to be?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. "A recognition of circumstances," he said. "Earth is young. Your species is energetic. There are concerns among several member states about the pace of your expansion." "We have 4 colonies," I said. "The Vale have 67. "The comparison is not useful," he said. "The Vale have been members for 2 centuries. "Is that the threshold?" I asked. 2 centuries of membership before expansion is permitted." He did not answer that. He turned back to the window. "The determination has been made," he said again. "I thought it was courteous to tell you directly." I looked at the stars. I thought about what courteous meant to someone who had just informed me that my planet had been reclassified without consultation, without vote, and without any mechanism of appeal that I had been made aware of. "I appreciate the courtesy," I said, "truly." He nodded and began to move away. "Helvin," I said. He stopped. "I hope this works out the way your models suggest," I said. "I genuinely do, because if it doesn't, the next person Earth sends will not be someone like me." He looked at me for a moment. There was something careful in his expression now, something that had not been there before. But he said nothing, and after a moment he walked away into the crowd of delegates. I finished my small citrus thing. I looked at the stars. Somewhere behind me, in the polished formal chamber of the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy, 300 delegates had quietly decided that humanity was a problem to be managed. I thought about the men and women who had sent me here. I thought about the conversations in the rooms where those decisions are made. I thought about all the other options that had been discussed before someone said, "Let's try the diplomat first." I finished my drink. I straightened my jacket. I went back to my seat behind the plants. The reception that evening was held in the conclave's central social hall, a wide and beautiful space full of warm light and the soft overlapping sounds of 100 different languages being spoken at once. The ceiling was made of something that looked like glass but bent the light in unusual ways, so that the room always seemed to be lit from slightly the wrong direction. It was disorienting in a pleasant way, like the first few seconds of waking up somewhere new. I arrived on time. This was, I had been told by the junior aide assigned to me, slightly unusual. Most delegates arrived late to signal that they had better options for their evening. I did not have better options. I also wanted to see who was already in the room when I got there. The answer was, nobody important, which meant the room was being watched by people who wanted to see who arrived early. I noted the three individuals positioned at angles that gave them clear sightlines to the entrance. Two were in delicate dress from species I recognized. One was in the plain gray uniform of conclave administrative staff. They all looked at me when I walked in. I smiled at each of them in turn. Two of them looked away. The third held my gaze for a second longer than was comfortable and then looked at his drink. I got a glass of something pale gold from a passing tray and found a position near the center of the room where I could see most of the space without having my back to a wall. I did not need my back to a wall. I simply preferred it when available. Over the next 40 minutes I spoke to 11 people. A delegate from a small aquatic species called the merval, who seemed genuinely curious about human architecture. A pair of young conclave researchers who wanted to know if humans really had only one heart. An administrative translator who had been working with Earth's provisional mission for 2 years and was quietly, carefully nervous, in a way that told me she knew more about tonight's agenda than her job title suggested she should. I listened to all of them. I asked questions. I remembered every answer. It was during my conversation with the fourth delegate that I noticed the senior conclave marshal. His name in conclave records was something that translated approximately as Marshal Corvin. He was Drakvi. He was large even by their standards, which meant he stood at nearly 8 feet and wore the formal version of their armored dress uniform, which was not decorative. The plates across his shoulders were real. They had stopped real things before. His face was flat and hard with a jaw that protruded slightly forward, and his eyes were a deep amber that caught the light in a way that made them look like they were calculating something every time he blinked. He was not looking at me yet, but he had positioned himself between me and the main exit in a way that was almost certainly not accidental. I excused myself from my current conversation and drifted in his direction, not directly, but in the casual wandering way of someone who has spotted an interesting piece of art across the room. He let me come to him. That was interesting. "Envoy Grant," he said. His translated voice was flat and deliberate, like stones being placed one at a time. "Marshal Corvin," I said. "I was hoping we might speak." "I was going to suggest the same," he said. We stood together for a moment with our drinks. The room moved around us. Someone laughed somewhere to my left. The light shifted in the ceiling above us, and for a moment we were both standing in a pool of faint amber. "The client ward classification," I said. "I'd like to understand the specific legal pathway by which it was applied to Earth. The Conclave Charter requires a full member vote for classification changes. I reviewed the session records before traveling here and I did not see a vote on this item." "Procedural classifications do not require full vote," he said. "I wasn't aware Earth status change had been designated procedural," I said. "That designation itself requires a subcommittee review, and I haven't been able to locate those records either." He looked at me for a moment. "You reviewed the session records before traveling here." "I review everything before traveling anywhere," I said. Something shifted in his expression. It was small. "The classification stands," he said. "Earth's outer colony on Kepler-7 will be subject to a territorial assessment in the next session. You should prepare your mission for that process." "Prepare in what way?" I asked. "Prepare to accept the outcome," he said. I held my glass in both hands and looked at it for a moment. The pale gold liquid caught the light beautifully. I thought about what it would mean for the 340 people currently living on Kepler-7 to have their home reclassified as contested territory. I thought about their faces, which I did not know, but could imagine. People have similar faces when they are told the ground under them is not theirs. "I'll pass that along," I said. "And Marshal, just so the record is clear, I want you to know that I raised these procedural concerns formally, in person, with a senior conclave official. That conversation is noted in my mission log." He looked at me steadily. "Why would that matter?" "It probably won't," I said pleasantly, but I like to be thorough. He moved away shortly after that. I watched him go. I stayed in the room another hour. I spoke to 14 more people. I ate 4 things from passing trays, all of which were fine except the third, which had a faint bitterness in the aftertaste that I identified within 2 seconds and catalogued carefully in the back of my mind. I had encountered that particular compound before, not in food, in a different context entirely. It was not dangerous to me at the concentration present in that small appetizer. It would, however, have rendered a human with a less specific medical history mildly incapacitated for 4 to 6 hours. I ate the rest of it. I set the small dish down on the next passing tray. I did not look for the server who had brought it. Not yet. Looking for the server would signal that I had noticed, and I had found, over many years in many rooms, that the most useful thing you can do when someone reveals a piece of their intent is to let them believe the reveal went unnoticed. I already knew which table the tray had come from. I already knew that the tray's path through the room had brought it to me after passing within 2 meters of Marshal Corvin's position. I already knew that the administrative translator I had spoken to earlier had moved to the far side of the room approximately 5 minutes before that tray made its round. I knew several other things too. I kept them in order in my mind the way you keep tools on a workbench, each one in its place, each one ready. Near the end of the evening, I found Helvin again. He was standing near the east wall with a small group of Vale colleagues, and he saw me coming and stepped slightly away from the group in a way that was meant to look casual. "A pleasant evening," I said. "Productive," he agreed. "I had an interesting conversation with Marshal Corvin," I said. "I imagine you did." "He mentioned the Kepler-7 assessment," I said. "I want you to know, Helvin, that I have passed all of this information back to Earth in my nightly log. They know what was announced today. They know how it was announced. They know about the procedural irregularities." I paused. "They asked me what my recommendation was." He waited. "I told them to wait," I said. "I told them that I believed the conclave had not fully considered its position and that there was still time for a different outcome." He was very still, and if there isn't time. I looked at him. I kept my voice the same easy, conversational register it had been all evening. "Then Earth will send someone else to continue the discussion," I said. "And I want you to understand something, Helvin, because I do think you are a reasonable person and I do think this matters. I am the one they sent because I am the patient option. I am the one who talks first. I am the one who files procedural concerns and reviews session records and drinks whatever is put in front of me and smiles." I stopped. "The others are not like me." He looked at me for a long moment. The light in the ceiling shifted again. Somewhere behind us, music had started, something low and strange from an instrument I did not recognize. "You're threatening the conclave," he said quietly. "I am explaining a situation," I said. "There is a difference." I said good night. I walked back to my quarters through corridors that were clean and cool and nearly empty at this hour. I passed 2 conclave security personnel who noted my badge and let me through without comment. In my room, I sat at the small desk and opened my log. I wrote 3 paragraphs in plain, factual language. I noted the classification announcement. I noted the conversation with Marshal Corvin. I noted the food incident and my analysis of the compound involved. I noted my estimate of the chain of instruction that had led to that incident, which went from the server, to a catering coordinator, to an administrative official, to someone I had not yet identified but whose level of access to mission scheduling I had narrowed to 4 possible individuals. I noted all of this without editorial comment. I sent the log to Earth. Then I turned off the light and lay down on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling in the dark. I was not afraid. Fear is a tool. You use it when it is useful and you set it aside when it is not. Tonight, fear was not useful. What was useful was patience and clarity. and the particular kind of stillness that comes from knowing with absolute certainty that you are the most dangerous thing in the building. I closed my eyes. I slept. They came for me at 6 in the morning, station time. Not officially. There was no knock, no announcement. The door to my quarters opened and two conclave security officers stepped inside, and one of them said that I was requested at a briefing and that a shuttle was waiting. He said it politely. He held the door open. I was already dressed. I had been dressed for 20 minutes. I said nothing about the fact that they had entered without clearance. I simply picked up my small case and followed them into the corridor. The shuttle took me to a part of the station I had not been cleared to visit. I noted the route. I noted that we passed through two security checkpoints that should have required my credentials and did not. I noted that the officer sitting across from me had the faint tension in his shoulders of someone who has been given orders he is not entirely comfortable with. I said nothing about any of this. The room they brought me to was small and plainly furnished. A table, 4 chairs, a light fixture that was slightly too bright. There was no window. The air recycling vent was positioned directly behind the chair I was led to, and it was large, about 40 centimeters square, and the screws on its panel were only hand-tightened. I sat down. I placed my case on the table beside me. The two security officers stood by the door. A moment later, a third person entered. His name, according to his conclave identification badge, was Inquisitor Perv. He was Vale, but not the same type as Helvin. Where Helvin had the smooth composure of a career diplomat, Perv had the focused energy of someone who had spent his career in a different kind of room. He was shorter than most Vale, with close-set eyes and very clean hands. He moved with the precision of someone who measured all his movements before making them. He sat across from me. He placed a small, flat device on the table. He looked at me for a moment before speaking. "Envoy Grant," he said, "thank you for coming." "I didn't have much choice," I said pleasantly, "but I appreciate the courtesy of calling it a request." Something moved through his eyes, not quite amusement, something closer to assessment. "We are conducting a standard review of Earth's mission activity since your arrival," he said. "This is routine." "Of course," I said. "Do you conduct standard reviews at 6 in the morning in rooms without windows for all mission delegates?" "When necessary," he said. "Interesting scheduling," I said. He opened a file on the flat device and turned it slightly toward me, though not enough for me to read it clearly. "You had a conversation with Marshal Corvin last evening." "I did." "You raised procedural concerns about the client ward classification." "I did. I have those concerns formally logged in my mission record if you need the exact language." "You told him you had logged the conversation," Perv said. "I did." "Why?" I looked at him because I had. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the device. "You also spoke with at least 20 other delegates during the reception." 23, I said. "I like to meet people." He looked up at me. "You asked very specific questions." "I'm a specific person." "You asked Delegate Velarin about the Conclave's territorial assessment procedures. You asked Researcher Hadris about the composition of the station's security rotations. You asked 3 separate delegates about the legal history of the client ward classification." He paused. "That classification was announced for the first time this morning." "Yes," I said. "You asked about it before the announcement was made." "I asked about the legal framework for classification changes generally," I said. "I was curious. I had seen some unusual scheduling in the session agenda, and I wanted to understand the process. It seemed like good preparation." Perv sat back slightly. He had very still hands. I noticed that his right hand was closer to the interior of his jacket than his left. Not dramatically closer, just slightly. I noticed it the way I notice all things, automatically. "Envoy Grant," he said, "I want to be direct with you." "Please," I said. "Earth's mission here is operating outside its designated scope. The level of information gathering you have engaged in since your arrival is not consistent with the role of a provisional ward delegate. It suggests access to resources and methods that are not appropriate to Earth's current classification. I read session records, I said. I listen carefully when people talk to me. I notice things. Is any of that against conclave regulations? It depends on the intent, he said. My intent is to represent my planet well, I said. Is that also against regulations? He was quiet. He looked at me in the way that some people look at something that is not behaving the way they expected. I have had that look directed at me a number of times. It never stops being interesting. We are going to need to review your mission logs, he said. You are welcome to request them through the standard intermission protocol, I said. I will have them ready within the standard response window of 72 hours. We need them now. I looked at him for a moment. The standard protocol is 72 hours, I said again. His right hand moved. It moved toward the interior of his jacket, and I knew before it cleared the fabric what he was reaching for. The Conclave's neural compliance devices were standard issue for Inquisitor-level personnel, and I had read the technical specifications for them before traveling here. They caused a temporary disruption to neural signal processing. In most species, this produced a cooperative, compliant state for between 30 and 90 minutes. In humans, it produced a headache. My hand was on his wrist before the device cleared the holster. Not gripping, not squeezing, just there. My palm around the bones of his wrist, holding it still with a very specific amount of pressure that communicated without any ambiguity that the situation had changed. I looked at him. His eyes had gone wide. I wouldn't, I said. The two security officers by the door had moved. I was aware of them. I was aware of the angle of the door, the distance between us, the weight of the table, and approximately 4 other factors that I processed without effort or intention. They had moved, but they had not reached me. There was a fraction of a second in which they had assessed, and that assessment had given them pause. That fraction was all I needed. I am going to let go of your wrist, I said, in the same quiet, level tone I used for everything. And then I am going to continue sitting here, because I am a diplomat and this is a conversation and I have no interest in anything other than talking. I paused. But I need you to understand something before we continue. Perv was very still. I was sent here because I was the first choice, I said. Not the last, the first. There was a long conversation about what to do about this situation and multiple approaches were considered, and I was selected because the people who sent me believe in trying the patient, careful, diplomatic path before anything else. I looked at him steadily. I am the patient path. I am the careful, diplomatic version. I need you to understand that before you reach for anything else in that jacket. Neither of the security officers had come any closer. I found that informative. I let go of Perv's wrist. I folded my hands on the table. I waited. Perv sat very still for a long moment. His breathing was controlled, but only just. He was a professional, and he was working hard to remain one. What do you want? He asked. A seat, I said. A real one, not the gallery behind the plants. Not a provisional ward classification that can be revoked without a vote. A full member seat with the rights and standing that implies. That's what Earth wants. That's what I am here to request. The Conclave does not respond to. I know, I said. I'm not making a demand. I'm explaining a situation. The same way I explained it to Helvin. The same way I am explaining it to you now. I tilted my head slightly. You have a file on me. Most of it is probably wrong. I want you to go back to whoever put that file together and tell them that the man in room 4 is very clear about what he wants and very patient and very specific about what happens next if the conversation goes in the wrong direction. I picked up my case. I stood. The security officers were still by the door. I walked toward them. They moved aside. I don't know exactly when they decided to do that. I know only that they did. I walked out into the corridor and the door closed behind me, and I stood for a moment in the cool and quiet of the station's empty hallway, and I breathed once, slowly, and then I began walking back toward my quarters. Behind me, I heard nothing for a long time. Then I heard voices, low and urgent, the kind of voices that happen when three people need to agree quickly on what they are going to tell someone. I allowed myself a very small smile. I kept walking. There is a particular kind of silence that follows when a room full of powerful people realize they have made a mistake. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. It arrives slowly like weather, and by the time most people notice it, it has already been there for a while. I had learned to recognize it early, to feel it before it was visible, to use it. The conclave's inner corridor network was busier than it should have been for 7 in the morning station time. Small groups of delegates in the side passages, conversations that stopped when I walked past, a cluster of administrative staff near the East Junction who dispersed just a little too quickly. The station's social dynamics had shifted overnight. Not dramatically, just enough for someone paying attention to notice. I was paying attention. After I returned to my room and filed my morning report, I spent 2 hours reviewing documents, not the conclave's official session records, which I had already memorized, but the secondary materials, research filings, territorial assessment archives, administrative hearing records from the last 40 years. The conclave generated enormous amounts of written material, and almost none of it was classified at the level that would block a provisional delegate's access request, provided that delegate filed the right access forms in the right sequence. I had filed 17 access requests in my first 2 days on the station, most of them through the standard delegate portal, a few through the archive office, which operated on a separate system and had a response window of 8 hours. I had filed those at midnight, which meant the responses were arriving now. I read them. By 9 in the morning, I had found what I was looking for. The conclave's client ward classification had been used 4 times in its 400-year history. The first 2 were well documented. A species with no functional interstellar travel had been briefly classified as ward protected while they developed their own capacity. Another had been placed in receivership after a biological collapse that temporarily disabled their government structures. Both had been elevated to full membership within 30 years. Both classifications had gone through full member votes with documented deliberation. The third was in 2291, Conclave Reckoning, a small mercantile species called the HFY, classified as client ward on the grounds of instability. The classification was proposed by a subcommittee chaired by a delegate from a species called the Torvin. It passed on a procedural designation, not a full vote. The HFY remained client ward for 60 years. During that period, the Torvin expanded their mining operations into 3 HFY systems. I read that entry 3 times. The fourth was Earth, proposed by a subcommittee of which I could only access the membership list, not the deliberation records. But the membership list alone was enough. Of the 7 members on that subcommittee, 4 had direct territorial adjacency to human explored space. 2 of them had registered competing claims on systems within 40 light-years of our Kepler-7 colony in the previous session. I sat for a long time looking at that document. Then I did something very specific. I did not go to Helvin. I did not go to Perv. I did not go to Marshal Corvin. I did not raise my voice, file a formal objection, or make any kind of public demonstration. What I did instead was identify, through the conclave's own public delegate directory, the 6-member species most likely to have their own complicated relationship with the conclave's inner circle. I looked for species that had been in territorial disputes that were resolved in ways that favored the larger members. Species that had seen their associate membership applications delayed for years past their eligibility dates. Species that had submitted formal objections to conclave decisions in the last decade and had those objections quietly buried in procedural committees. I found 7 such species. I sent each of their lead delegates a polite, brief note asking if they had time for coffee. 6 of them said yes. The conversations were remarkable, not because of what I said, but because of what I didn't say. I brought nothing. I made no argument. I showed no documents. I simply sat with each of them in turn, in the small side cafes and meeting rooms around the station, and I asked them about their experience with the conclave. I asked questions that were specific and well-informed in ways that told them I had done real research. And I listened. By the end of the day, I had 6 people who understood that I understood their situations in detail, and that I was not going to be here for long, and did not need anything from them personally, but that I thought they deserved to know they were not the only ones with this particular experience. I did not ask them to act. I did not need to. The station had a social network. Every large organization does. It is not formal. It is made of shared meals and hallway conversations and the memory of who said what 2 years ago. Information moves through it quickly when the right conditions are present. I had spent 3 days creating the right conditions. On the evening of my 4th day, I received a message from the conclave's Administrative Ethics Division. It was formal and official and entirely routine in its language. It informed me that my access requests for the subcommittee deliberation records on Earth's classification had been reviewed, that an anomaly had been identified in the filing procedure, and that a formal inquiry was being opened. The message was sent to me. It was also, as was standard in the Ethics Division's process, logged in the public administrative record, visible to all member delegates. I read it twice. I set my device down. I went to the window and looked at the stars and felt something that I do not often permit myself in working environments. I felt satisfied. Not triumphant, not vindicated. Simply satisfied, the way you feel when something you built with patience and precision works exactly as intended. Helvin came to me that evening, not at a reception, directly to my door. I opened it, and he stood in the corridor looking at me with an expression that was no longer composed in the way it had been when we first met. There was something underneath it now, something that was working hard to understand a situation it had not anticipated. "Come in," I said. He came in. He sat in the chair near the window. I sat across from him. "What have you done?" he said. "I filed access requests," I said. "I had coffee with some colleagues. I responded to an ethics inquiry." "You have opened a formal investigation into 4 conclave council members." "I provided documentation to the ethics division," I said. "The ethics division opened the investigation. That is their process." He looked at me for a long time. "You did this in 4 days." "I work quickly when I'm motivated," I said. "You were motivated by a seating arrangement," he said. "I was motivated by the illegal reclassification of my planet without a proper vote, by a poisoning attempt, by an unlawful detention, and by 60 years of precedent showing what client ward status actually means in practice." I paused. The seating arrangement was just the first thing I noticed. He was quiet. Out the window, a small maintenance vessel moved past the station's exterior, its running lights blinking steady and slow. "What does Earth want?" he said. It was the same question Perv had asked, but this time it was being asked differently, not as a tactical probe, as a real question. "The same thing I told Perv," I said. "A seat, full membership, real standing, and an immediate halt to any territorial assessment of Kepler-7 while the ethics inquiry is ongoing." "The last item is not within my authority," he said. "Then find someone for whom it is," I said. He looked at his hands. "You understand that if this inquiry proceeds, it will be disruptive to the conclave's normal operations." "I understand that," I said. "It could destabilize relationships that have taken decades to build. Relationships built on an illegal process that extracted resources from a species that had no standing to object," I said quietly. "I have sympathy for the disruption. I have less sympathy for the relationships." He was quiet for a long time. "If Earth received full membership," he said, What assurance would the conclave have that this kind of? He searched for the word. Preparation, I offered. Disruption, he said, would not continue. I thought about that for a moment. It was a real question and it deserved a real answer. None, I said. Earth will be a fully engaged member. We will pay attention, file documents, ask questions, and advocate for our position, and for others whose positions deserve advocacy. That is what full members do. I looked at him. If the conclave is afraid of a member that pays attention, that tells you something about the conclave worth examining. He left an hour later. I did not know exactly what he was going to do, but I knew which way the weight was moving. You develop a feel for that over time. The way you feel the change in a room before anyone has said anything, the way certain silences have a direction to them. The weight was moving toward yes. I made a cup of tea with the small unit in my room and sat with it in the dark near the window and thought about the people on Kepler 7, 340 of them, families, researchers, engineers, people who had gone somewhere difficult and made something real there. They did not know I was here. They did not know their home had been briefly listed as contested territory. They did not know that their continued standing in the galaxy had, for a few days, rested in part on me sitting in chairs and drinking things and asking questions. They would never know. That was fine. That was the nature of the work. I drank my tea. I looked at the stars. I thought about all the things I had not done in the last 4 days. All the things that had been available to me, had I chosen to use them. All the rooms I had walked out of under my own power, with no visible damage, leaving behind only paperwork and quiet conversations, and a few people who now looked at me differently than they had before. Patience, I thought, is not weakness. It is the most precise instrument available. I went to sleep. The membership vote was scheduled for the 3rd session of the following week, which meant I had 4 days to wait. I did not wait quietly. Not in an aggressive way. Not in any way that anyone outside a small group of people would have noticed. But there is a difference between waiting and holding still, and I did the former while doing very little of the latter. On the first day I met with the Merville delegate whose name, as close as my translation device could render it, was something like Tesven. She was the one who had asked me about human architecture at the first reception. She had an easy manner and a careful mind, and she had been waiting for 3 years for a formal response to a boundary dispute claim her species had filed with the Conclave's Territorial Committee. The claim had been listed as pending since its submission. No hearing date had been set. I spent an hour with her reviewing the filing and identified 2 procedural arguments that, if raised correctly in the next session, would force the committee to either schedule a hearing or formally justify the delay. I wrote both arguments out in plain, clean language and gave them to her. She looked at the document for a moment, then she looked at me. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Because the argument is correct," I said, "and because I would rather have allies than not." She was quiet for a moment. "We are a small species," she said. "We do not have much to offer in return." "A vote is a vote," I said, "and I don't keep accounts. I just help when I can." On the second day, I tracked down the specific administrative official who I had determined was the 3rd link in the chain that led to the food incident at the reception. I did not confront this person. I did not report them to station security. What I did was ensure that certain pieces of documentation, which I had obtained legally, and which were relevant to the ethics inquiry already in progress, were submitted through the correct channel at a time that would make it very difficult for that inquiry to be quietly closed without a full review. I then sent a copy of the submission confirmation to Helvin, with no accompanying note. On the 3rd day, Perv requested a second meeting. I went. Same room, same table, same 2 bright light. But the 2 security officers were not there this time, and Perv's hands were folded on the table rather than near his jacket, and he had brought 2 cups of something warm which he pushed one of toward me before speaking. I noted the difference. I sat down. "The ethics inquiry is proceeding," he said. "I know," I said. You know that the individuals named in it have significant standing in the conclave. I know that too. It would be easier, he said carefully, if there were a way to address Earth's concerns without the inquiry continuing. I looked at him. Are you asking me to withdraw the documentation I submitted? I'm asking what Earth's priorities are, he said. I thought about that. I drank some of the warm thing which tasted faintly of cardamom and something earthy. Earth's priority is membership, I said. Full membership. The inquiry is not Earth's priority. The inquiry exists because there was wrongdoing and the ethics division is the correct body to address it. I cannot and would not interfere with that process. I set the cup down. But if the conclave moves forward with a genuine, properly voted membership elevation for Earth in the next session, I will make no further documentation submissions. Everything I currently hold has already been provided to the Ethics Division. What they do with it is their business. He was quiet. That's not a deal, I said. I'm not trading one for the other. I'm simply telling you what my actions will and won't be. You're telling me that if we give Earth what it wants, you will stop making trouble, he said. I'm telling you that if Earth receives what it is legally entitled to, I will stop pointing out the places where the law was broken, I said. Yes. He looked at me for a long time. You are a very unusual diplomat, he said. I've been told that, I said. The vote came on the scheduled day. I was in the chamber early. I sat in the front row, the same suit, the same posture, no plants nearby. The herald moved through the session agenda with the same careful formality as always. There were two other items before Earth's membership consideration: a resource dispute between two mid-tier members, a procedural amendment to observation status requirements. I listened to both fully. Then my item. The herald read the proposal for Earth's elevation from provisional client ward status to full member standing, with all associated rights and responsibilities. He read the names of the 12 co-sponsors from member species. Tesvan's species was among them. So were 3 others I had met for coffee. So were 2 I had never spoken to, which told me the weight had been moving in directions I hadn't even tracked. The vote opened. I kept my hands in my lap. I looked at the floor of the chamber. I did not watch the board where the votes were registering. I had done what I could do. The rest was not mine to control, and I had learned a long time ago that watching the outcome you cannot influence is one of the least useful ways to spend the seconds before it arrives. A hand touched my shoulder briefly. I looked up. The Merville delegate Tesvan was in the row behind me. She gave me a short, firm nod. I nodded back. The herald read the result. 219 in favor, 41 opposed, 12 abstentions. The chamber produced a sound that I had not heard before. Not applause exactly, more of a shifting and settling, like a large group of people rearranging their understanding of something. I sat with it for a moment. Then I stood, because the protocol required the new member to stand, and I stood and I looked at the room, all 300 tiers of it, all the faces and limbs and eye configurations, and whatever other features the various species present used to look at things. Most of them were looking at me. I did not grin. I did not raise my fist. I did not feel the need for any of that. I simply stood straight and inclined my head in the conclave's formal acknowledgement gesture, which I had practiced until it was exactly correct, and then I sat down again. After the session, I walked back through the main corridor, and the side passages, and the small junction near the East cafeteria. And people moved differently around me than they had on my first day. Not dramatically, just the small adjustments that happen when the social weight of a space has shifted. I passed Inquisitor Perv near the corridor junction. He stopped. I stopped. He looked at me for a moment, the way people look at something they have reassessed and are still revising their assessment of. Your wrist, I said, is it better? He blinked. Yes, he said. Good, I said, take care. I walked on. Marshal Corvin I did not see that day or the next. I knew he was still on the station. I knew the ethics inquiry would be reaching his level of the chain within the next week. I did not seek him out. I had no need to. On my last evening, I sat in the station's outer observation lounge, where the view of the surrounding stars was unobstructed by the station's structure. It was a public space, and it was mostly empty at that hour. Just a few maintenance staff moving through at the edges, and one young delegate from a species I didn't recognize who was sitting at the far end writing something in a small book. I sat near the center of the long window. I looked at the stars. They are remarkable things, not because they are beautiful, though they are, because of what they mean at this scale. Out there, in the space between those points of light, there were ships moving, colonies growing, species waking up to the fact that the universe was larger than they had imagined. There were problems being created and problems being solved, and conversations being had in rooms not unlike this one. And somewhere among all of it, very small, was a species that had spent most of its history doing terrible things to itself, and learning from every single one of them, and coming out on the other side with a particular kind of knowledge that the universe had not yet understood how to account for. We were good at surviving things. We were good at adapting to things. And we were extraordinarily good, when the situation required it, at sitting very still in a room full of people who thought we were the least dangerous presence in it. I thought about the conversation I would have when I got home. Not a debrief exactly, more of a check-in. The kind where someone who sent you to do something asks how it went and you give them the truthful version, not the official version. The truthful version was, fine, better than expected in some places, exactly as expected in others. No permanent damage to anything or anyone. I was proud of that, quietly. My device chimed. A message from Earth from my handler, a careful man named Philip Doyle who had been in this line of work longer than I had and who communicated in very short sentences. It said vote confirmed on our end. Well done, anything to flag. I considered the question. I thought about Perv and the wrist. I thought about the food at the reception. I thought about the room with no windows and the hand-tightened screws on the ventilation panel. I thought about 23 conversations and 17 document requests and 6 cups of coffee and one very specific moment when everything in a small room went very still. I typed no incidents. His reply came back in under a minute. Were there almost incidents? I looked at the stars. I thought about the 41 delegates who had voted against us. I thought about what they were thinking right now. I thought about the ethics inquiry that was still in progress and the individuals who knew their names were in those documents. I thought about the fact that this was the beginning, not the end, and that full membership meant full engagement, and that the conclave was about to discover what it meant to have humanity as a genuine participant in its proceedings, rather than a client ward in the outer gallery. I thought about all the things I had chosen not to do. I typed define incidents. Philip's response took a full 3 minutes this time. When it came, it was 4 words. Noted, get some rest. I put the device away. I looked at the window. The young delegate at the far end of the lounge was still writing in their small book. The stars outside were still doing what stars do, which is burn quietly and indifferently, and without concern for the small heated dramas of the creatures who lived in the spaces between them. I felt something I identified carefully as contentment. Not because we had won something, not because someone had been defeated, but because we had done it the right way, the patient way, the way that left the doors open and the records clean and the relationships intact, or at least repairable, which is the best you can usually hope for in rooms like these. I had come here as Earth's first real representative. I was leaving as something the conclave now had to account for. That was progress. That was, in fact, exactly what I had been sent to accomplish. I sat until the maintenance staff began their evening rounds, and the lights in the lounge shifted to a lower, quieter setting. Then I stood. I straightened my jacket. I said goodnight to no one in particular. I went to bed. In the morning, Earth had a seat at the table, and the galaxy, slowly, carefully, with the particular caution of something that has just learned a useful lesson, began to pay attention.